The ferry was delayed by 20 minutes, and Petra had already claimed the last window seat on the upper deck. That was the thought running through Hazel's mind as she stood at the top of the stairs, coffee in one hand, her tote bag slipping off her shoulder, staring at the one spot she always sat in on her morning commute across the harbor from North Vancouver to downtown. She had taken that ferry every single weekday for 3 years. Seat 14, upper deck, port side, right by the window where you could watch the city skyline come into view as the boat pulled away from the dock. It wasn't assigned, it wasn't reserved, but it was hers. The way a favorite mug is yours even when it technically belongs to everyone in the office. The woman sitting in it didn't look up. She had a laptop open, a half-eaten granola bar balanced on her knee, and the kind of settled-in posture that said she had absolutely no intention of moving. Hazel cleared her throat. Nothing. She stepped closer. "Excuse me, I think you might be in my seat." The woman finally looked up. She had dark eyes and a sharp expression and the tiniest flicker of amusement crossing her face. "Your seat? I sit here every morning. There's no name on it. I know, but there's a free one right over there." The woman nodded toward the aisle seat, 2 rows back, the one with the sticky armrest that Hazel had complained about to BC Ferries twice without response. Then she went back to her laptop. Hazel stood there for a full 5 seconds. She wanted to say something. She could feel the words forming, polite but firm, the way her mother had always taught her. Instead, she turned around, walked to the sticky armrest seat, and spent the entire 40-minute crossing staring at the back of a stranger's head. She never even learned her name. The woman got off at the downtown terminal, disappeared into the crowd on Waterfront Station, and that was that. Hazel told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she'd forgotten about it by Tuesday. She hadn't. Her name was Hazel Pemberton, and she was 31 years old, which she was starting to feel meant something different in Vancouver than it had when she was 25. At 25, 31 had sounded like the age when everything would be sorted. Career, apartment, someone to share it with. She had 2 of the 3. The interior design firm she worked at had just promoted her to senior associate. Her 1-bedroom in Kitsilano had a balcony and a view of the mountains if you craned your neck. But the third thing kept slipping away from her in ways she couldn't quite explain to her mother, who called every Sunday and always, without fail, got around to it. "You work too much," her mother Patricia said one evening in early October, right on schedule. "You're always the last one at the office. No man is going to meet you at your desk." "Hazel, plenty of people meet people at work, Mom. You work with 3 women and a man who's been married for 20 years. Hazel poured herself a glass of wine. "I go out." "When?" She thought about it. "Last month I went to that gallery opening with Diane. That was a work event. Socializing counts." Her mother made a sound that was not agreement. Then, after a pause, "My friend Joan has a son. He's 35. He's an architect. He's lovely, and she keeps asking me if I'd introduce the 2 of you." "Absolutely not." "Hazel, Mom, the last time you set me up with someone it took me 4 months to stop getting texts from him about cryptocurrency. This is different. Joan's son is nothing like that. He's quiet, he's thoughtful, she says he's been through a hard time and he's ready to settle down. She's been asking me for a year." "A year?" "I kept telling her you weren't ready. But you're 31 now." Hazel leaned her head back against the couch cushions. "What's his name?" "Felix. And you've met him?" "Once, at Joan's dinner last Christmas. Very well-mannered. Good handshake." "You're recommending him based on his handshake. I'm recommending him based on 30 years of knowing his mother, and the fact that you haven't been on a date since April." Her mother's voice softened slightly. "Just meet him for coffee. If it's terrible, you never have to see him again. But at least try." Hazel stared at the ceiling. The mountains were not visible from this angle, only the dark sky over the city and her own reflection in the balcony door. "1 coffee," she said. "That's it." She agreed to meet him the following Saturday at a place on West 4th that she'd been to a dozen times. Neutral territory, she told herself. Familiar ground. She arrived 7 minutes early, ordered a flat white, and picked a table by the window where she could see who walked in. The door opened. She recognized the posture before she recognized the face. Settled. Certain. The kind of body language that said this person moved through the world without particularly worrying about who was watching. The woman from the ferry looked around the cafe. Then she walked toward Hazel's table. For a moment Hazel thought it was a mistake. The woman would keep walking, sit somewhere else, open her laptop and claim another seat that wasn't technically hers. But she stopped right in front of Hazel and looked at her with that same trace of amusement from before, except now there was something else underneath it. Something closer to discomfort. "You're Joan's son's," the woman started. "You're Joan's son?" Hazel said at the same time. A beat of silence. Felix is my brother, the woman said. I'm Ren, he's running late. He asked me to let you know. She sat down across from Hazel because apparently that was just something she did. She sat down in seats. Hazel stared at her. You were on the ferry. I take it every morning. You took my seat. Ren tilted her head slightly. The one with no name on it? I've been sitting in that seat for 3 years, and now you've sat in it for 2 years and 364 days. Congratulations on the streak. She picked up the laminated menu and scanned it without any apparent awareness that Hazel was still deciding whether to leave. He'll be here in 10 minutes, Felix. He got stuck on a call. Hazel did not leave. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because her mother would hear about it from Joan within 24 hours. Maybe because some stubborn part of her refused to let this woman make her move twice. She stayed in her seat and asked for a second flat white and watched Ren order a tea with the unhurried manner of someone who had never once been rattled by any situation in her life. Felix arrived 12 minutes later, slightly breathless, apologizing as he came through the door. He was tall, with the same dark eyes as his sister, but where Ren had a stillness to her, Felix moved like he was always catching up to himself. He shook Hazel's hand, thanked her for waiting, and sat down and immediately said the wrong thing about the neighborhood, corrected himself, laughed at his own correction, and something about it was so genuinely undefended that Hazel found herself relaxing slightly. Ren stayed for exactly long enough to make things awkward and then said she had somewhere to be. She didn't say goodbye to Hazel specifically. She just left. Felix watched her go. She's an acquired taste, he offered. Does she always sit down in places uninvited? He seemed to think about this honestly. Yes, he said, she does. The coffee with Felix was fun. He was kind, attentive, clearly nervous in a way he was trying to cover with competence. And Hazel could tell that Joan had talked him up in exactly the same way Patricia had talked her up to Joan. He was an architect. He'd gone through a long engagement that ended 2 years ago and hadn't dated much since. He asked her real questions and listened to the answers. By the time she got home, she had agreed to dinner the following weekend. She didn't think about Ren again until Thursday morning, when she boarded the ferry and found seat 14 empty. She sat in it. The familiar view of the Burrard Inlet opened up ahead of her, gray-green water under an October sky, and she thought, fine. Good. Then she thought about the way Ren had said 2 years and 364 days without missing a beat, and she had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. Dinner with Felix was pleasant. He took her to a Japanese restaurant in Yaletown that she'd wanted to try for years, and he talked about his work with the kind of quiet passion that made it clear. He was one of those people who had found the right thing to do with their life. She liked him. She was not sure if she liked him in the right way, but she liked him. He texted the next morning. Had a really good time. Same time next week? She said yes. 3 weeks later, Patricia called on a Sunday, and for the first time in recent memory did not circle back to the subject of Hazel's love life. She spent the whole call talking about how Joan had cried at their book club because she was so happy Felix had met someone nice. Mom, Hazel said carefully, it's been 3 weeks. Joan was very emotional. We've been on 4 dates. 4 good ones? Hazel looked out at the mountains, which were properly visible today, snow on the peaks for the first time that season. Yes, she admitted. 4 good ones. She met Ren again at Felix's birthday dinner in November, a low-key gathering at their mother Joan's house in Deep Cove. Hazel brought wine and tried not to feel like she was being evaluated, which was difficult because Joan evaluated everyone with great sincerity and tremendous warmth, and the effect was somehow more intense than hostility. Ren was in the kitchen when Hazel arrived, making some kind of salad dressing from scratch with the focused attention she seemed to give everything. She glanced up when Hazel came in. Wine's open on the counter. Thank you. Felix told me you're an interior designer. Senior associate at a firm. Yes. Ren went back to whisking. He said you've been doing some residential work lately. Mostly. Yeah. The commercial projects are interesting, but the residential ones feel more personal. You actually see how people live in the spaces you design. Ren was quiet for a moment. I'm an architect, she said. Residential, mostly. Infill housing. Hazel hadn't known that. Felix hadn't mentioned it. She looked at Ren more carefully, the efficient way she moved in the small kitchen, the slight angle of concentration in her shoulders, and thought, of course. Do you work on the same projects? Hazel asked. Occasionally. We try not to. We have different ideas about almost everything. Is that a problem? Ren looked up again, and this time the amusement was warmer, less pointed. Not anymore. Dinner was good. Felix was relaxed in a way he wasn't on dates, comfortable in his mother's house, easy with his sister, making gentle jokes that Hazel could tell were old family ones from the way everyone smiled without explaining them. Joan fussed over the food and kept touching Hazel's arm at small moments, a warmth so genuine it was slightly overwhelming. Hazel's own family was more reserved. Physical affection was the handwritten card, the specific gift for a specific interest. Joan's family expressed themselves by feeding you and standing close. On the drive home, Hazel found herself thinking it was easier than she'd expected. By December, she and Felix were something recognizable. He had met her friends. She had keys to his apartment for reasons that had started practically. She'd left her scarf there and hadn't entirely resolved. They didn't fight. They communicated well. They wanted similar things. She told Diane one evening over dinner that she thought this might actually work out. "You don't sound excited," Diane observed. "I'm cautious," Hazel said. "There's a difference." Diane looked at her over her water glass. "Is there?" Hazel went home and thought about it and couldn't entirely answer the question. She saw Wren on the ferry 3 more times that December. They didn't always talk. Sometimes Wren had her laptop open and Hazel had her headphones in, and they passed the 40-minute crossing in parallel silence that was, Hazel noticed, not uncomfortable. Twice they ended up at the same railing watching the city approach, and Wren said things that were brief and specific and somehow opened up longer thoughts in Hazel's mind that she was still turning over when she walked to the office. Once Wren said, out of nowhere, looking at the skyline, "You're good for him, you know." Hazel looked at her. "Felix? He's less anxious. He laughs more." Wren watched the water. "He had a rough couple of years. He told me about the engagement." Wren nodded once. She didn't add anything. She didn't need to. In January, Felix brought up the future. Not in a pressuring way. He was too careful for that. But in the way that happens when 2 people have been seeing each other for 3 months and at least one of them needs to understand if they're moving in the same direction. He said he was thinking about the long term. He said he didn't want to rush her. He said he'd had one relationship where he'd assumed things were aligned that weren't, and he didn't want to do that again. Hazel appreciated his honesty. She said she was thinking about the long term too. She said she needed a little more time to be sure. He said, "Of course, take whatever time you need." She went home and sat on her balcony even though it was January, and the temperature was 4 degrees, and she watched the lights across the water and tried to locate exactly what she was waiting to feel. She was still trying when her phone buzzed with a message from Wren. "Felix told me what you said. Thank you for being honest with him." And then, a minute later, "He deserves someone who's sure." Hazel stared at the message for a long time. She almost typed, but she didn't. She was not sure. It wasn't that Felix was wrong for her. He was right in almost every measurable way. He was kind, he was reliable. He had made it clear he wanted what she wanted. The feeling she was waiting for, the certain anchoring kind, was the only thing missing, and she kept telling herself it would arrive, that it took time, that the movies had lied to everyone about how it actually felt, but it hadn't arrived. And she was 31 and honest enough with herself to know that waiting for it wasn't entirely fair to him. She broke up with Felix on a Wednesday night, in late January, at his apartment, with the care the situation deserved. She said exactly what was true, that she cared about him, and that wasn't the same as being certain, and he deserved someone who was certain. He was quiet for a while. Then he said he appreciated her telling him directly. Then she left, and she walked to the bus stop in the cold and sat on a bench and felt genuinely, sincerely sad in the way you feel when you've lost something real, even if you know you've made the right call. She did not tell Patricia for 2 weeks. When she did, her mother went quiet for long enough that Hazel braced herself. Then Patricia said, "You're sure?" "Yes." "Okay," Patricia said. And that was it. The most un-Patricia response she produced in 31 years. The ferry schedule changed in February. New timetable, slightly different route, nothing dramatic. Seat 14 was still seat 14. Wren's was not on the morning crossing for 3 weeks. Hazel assumed she'd changed her schedule or was working remotely. She told herself she hadn't noticed. She had obviously noticed. She was not sure what exactly she was noticing, which was its own problem. In early March, Wren was back. She got on at the North Vancouver terminal the same as always, came up the stairs, and found Hazel in seat 14, and this time, for the first time since October, she sat down in the seat next to Hazel instead of the one across the aisle. Hazel looked at her. "Felix told me," Wren said by way of greeting. "I know. I'm sorry. Don't be. You were right." Wren unzipped her jacket slightly. The harbor was gray and cold outside, the kind of Vancouver morning that looked beautiful in photographs and felt like damp wool in real life. "He's okay. He started seeing someone last week, a structural engineer he met at a conference. That was fast. He does better when he has somewhere to put his energy." Ren said it without any particular judgment. He's already happier. Hazel watched the dock pulling away behind them. That's good. Ren didn't respond right away. Outside the window, a cormorant sat on a navigation buoy, completely still. Why did you end it? She asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. Hazel thought about the right way to say it. I kept waiting to feel something I wasn't feeling, and I didn't think it was fair to keep waiting. Ren was quiet for a moment. What were you waiting to feel? Hazel opened her mouth and realized she didn't have a clean answer. I'm not sure exactly. I've been trying to figure that out. Ren nodded slowly. Then she said, in the same offhand tone she used for most things, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you something for 3 months, and I haven't done it yet, which is unusual for me. Hazel turned to look at her directly. I was interested in you before Felix was, Ren said. I thought about telling you when we met in the cafe, but Felix was already on his way and I'd encouraged it, so it didn't seem right. Then things progressed and I told myself it was irrelevant. She looked out the window, the cormorant was gone. Then you ended it, and I had to decide whether to say anything or let it alone. The ferry moved through the gray water. Hazel sat very still. So I'm telling you, Ren said. You don't have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. Hazel thought about October on the ferry. She thought about November in the kitchen at Joan's house whisking dressing. She thought about February, when she'd noticed the empty seat and told herself she hadn't. The seat, she said finally. Ren glanced at her. The first time I met you, you sat in my seat. Now you're sitting next to me. I'm adapting, Ren said with that contained amusement. Hazel felt something she hadn't been able to locate in months settle quietly into place. Ask me for coffee, she said. Ren looked at her for a moment. That's not usually how I do things. I know, do it anyway. Ren looked back out the window. A pause. Then, would you like to get coffee? After this, yes, Hazel said. I would. They rode the rest of the crossing in a silence that felt entirely different from the silences before. Warmer, lighter, like something had stopped being held back. When the ferry docked at the downtown terminal, they walked off together, and instead of disappearing into the crowd at Waterfront Station the way Ren had every morning before this one, she turned right toward the small cafe on the corner, where, Hazel would later learn, Ren had been getting her tea every morning for 2 years. It wasn't easy, exactly. Patricia needed a full Sunday call to process the information. Joan, to her tremendous credit, called Patricia the same evening and said she was happy for them both, and the important thing was that her son was happy, which he was. Felix took a while longer. He was generous about it, but he was human, and it took until April before the 4 of them could be in the same room at the same time, without a current of effort running underneath the ease. But Felix's structural engineer turned out to be someone named Meg, who had strong opinions about cantilever design, and somehow this made him entirely, completely himself, in a way that Hazel could see clearly now that she wasn't the one responsible for it. At Joan's Easter dinner, Hazel watched Felix argue happily with Meg about a project he was working on, and Ren leaned close and said quietly, "He's really good like this," and Hazel said, "I know," and meant it. There were hard parts. Ren was not easy to fight with. She was too precise, too calm, too good at finding the exact word for a problem in a way that occasionally made Hazel feel like she was being diagnosed. They disagreed about how much time they needed apart and how much was too much. There was an autumn evening in their second year together when they sat on opposite ends of Ren's couch and did not speak for 45 minutes, and Hazel was briefly convinced it was over. It wasn't. Ren eventually said, "I'm not good at asking for help. I want to be better at it with you." And Hazel said, "I'm not good at saying when I'm afraid." Same. And that was its own kind of turning point, slower than a revelation but more durable. In the spring of their 3rd year, they bought a small house in East Vancouver together. Ren designed the renovation, a clean, functional expansion that brought in light and opened up the back of the property into the garden. Hazel did the interior. They argued about 3 things and agreed on everything else, which felt, by that point, like a reasonable average. The day they got the keys, they stood in the empty main room with afternoon light coming through the new windows, sawdust still on the floors, and Hazel thought about the ferry. She thought about seat 14 and the stranger who had sat in it, and the strange, indirect route from that morning to this one. Ren said, looking at the light on the floor, "This is good." Hazel agreed with her. "Yes," she said, "it really is."